This week on Waterways, spoonbill nesting trouble, and marathon mystery wreck. Florida, one of the first territories to be discovered by European explorers, and one of the last territories in the United States to be fully mapped and settled. Though Florida was late to be settled, it's wasted no time catching up. Florida's 16 million residents make it the fourth most populous state in the nation. In Florida, the only number growing faster than its population is its number of boats. In the 6 years between 1996 and 2002, the number of registered boats in the state increased by 23%. One of Florida's last strongholds for nesting spoonbills is an island in Florida Bay called Frank Key. Frank Key might be one of the places where increased boat traffic is too much for spoonbills.
Traditionally, there have been it's been the second or third largest roseate spoonbill nesting colony in the bay. And in the last couple of years, we've noticed that those numbers are going down, the success is going down, and there's a lot of mortality of chicks. And unlike the other islands where there are mortality, where it just seems to be starvation, the failure of the parents to raise the young, what we had this time was predation. And slowly but surely, we were observing more and more chicks being killed in the nest and consumed.
Only 75 pairs of spoonbills nested on Frank Key in 2005, compared with 107 pairs in 2003. But more alarming than that, only 6 young survived to fledge in 2005. This made the Frank Key colony an almost complete failure. Like any good detective, Jerry Lorenz and his team at the Audubon Society's Tavernier Science Center staked out Frank Key. What he found broke his heart.
We went out there, I stayed in a kayak right offshore, and as soon as we came up on that island, crows came in. And of course the crows are really smart, efficient predators. So as soon as we approached the island, they would come in and hit the nests. Well, in addition to that, the black-crowned night herons, which is also an efficient predator, learned to follow the crows. And so there were about 20 or 30 of those around too. And we ended up with this huge mortality event. What we observed, these boats come through there on plane. And every time they would come through on plane, the spoonbills would take off their nest. And even if they're off their nest for a minute, the crows were on those babies, on those chicks, and just tearing them to pieces.
Within seconds of reaching the spoonbill nests, crows eat spoonbill eggs and spoonbill chicks. Without the protection of their parents, baby spoonbills are defenseless. Lorenz thinks that it may have taken a few years for crows to figure out that when loud boats pass Frank Key, dinner awaits.
But crows are also very long-lived, and so once they learn that, they're around for years. And the other crows are going to see them doing it, say, oh, I'm going to get a piece of that pie. And so over the course of 4 or 5 years, they've learned this. And now they waste no time. If those birds come off the nest, it's amazing how quickly crows hit that island.
And once their chicks are killed, spoonbills rarely nest again.
It takes an exact chain of events for spoonbills to successfully nest. And anywhere in that chain, if you break the needs of the birds right at that time, the nesting fails. And it's not like they just start over, because the conditions may not prompt them to go through courtship again or go through the egg phase again. After this mortality event, we saw the spoonbills come back. We saw them start to act like they were going to nest, and then they disappeared.
Boaters who run next to Frank Key probably don't intend to spook spoonbills. Instead, they just want to use an unmarked tidal channel that passes alongside the island to get to Palm Lake, a popular fishing destination. The channel has been there for a long time, but each year the bay and Frank Key get more and more boat traffic. This year's failure of the colony at Frank Key has spoonbill expert Lorenz worried. Spoonbills have made it into the 21st century by surviving threat after threat. Jerry Lorenz fears there are few places left for spoonbills to go.
Frank Key is traditionally the second or third largest spoonbill colony in the bay. Sandy's almost always the first, and then Frank and Turnkey flip back and forth. Now, these birds are finding it harder and harder to find suitable places away from people to be able to nest, and so Frank is a terribly important colony. And eventually we may end up with no nesting colonies except on Sandy Key, and that's not going to cut it. They're not going to, we're not going to have 500 nests on Sandy Key. The most nests recorded on that island, I think, are less than 200. And so, you're just taking away all the options for these birds.
In the fall of 2005, Hurricane Wilma tore apart Carl Ross Key, defoliated Frank and Sandy Keys, and left spoonbill nesting colonies at risk. Therefore, Everglades National Park temporarily closed Carl Ross Key and the channel near Frank Key during the 4-month 2005-2006 spoonbill nesting season. The closure will last until March 15, 2006. The objective of these closures is to try to restore the roseate spoonbill nesting colony at Frank Key and to prevent the failure of the colony at Sandy Key, the last remaining large spoonbill colony in Florida Bay. People new to the area should make note of the time of year and take this advice from Jerry Lorenz.
The islands can be approached pretty safely during the wet season, during the summer months, from basically June through, say, November. There's not much nesting going on, and the birds that are nesting are not likely to be disturbed. But starting in November and clearly going through at least March, the wading birds are very susceptible, and the islands should be avoided. If you don't know what islands are important, then you should stay away from those islands by at least several hundred feet. So that's what I would recommend, is if you're not familiar with the bay and you're not familiar with these islands, give them a wide berth.
Seeing a flock of deep pink spoonbills at sunset in Florida Bay is a sight of beauty and excitement for locals and tourists alike. For scenes like this to continue, spoonbills must be given the peace and quiet they need to survive, now rather than later.
The professional guides, they're not always going to have the best day, and they're looking for things to show their clients. Even if they're having a good fishing day, it's great to see spoonbills. It's great to see these wading birds. People get excited about it. A lot of people are just here to go fishing, but most of them are not. Most of them are here for the experience.
The passage between the Florida Keys and Cuba has proven a challenge throughout maritime history. Without the use of modern technology, only the wise, the skilled, and the lucky survived. Those in search of treasure, trade, and diplomacy often paid the price. The Great Reef of Florida's archipelago is in constant change. Channels appear, channels disappear. This environment proved to be a formidable adversary, most fatal in combination with hurricane-force winds. Commonly referred to as the Straits of Florida, this treacherous trade route was frequently used by the Spanish fleet during their Caribbean conquest in the colonial era. One such route the various fleets traveled has become known as Hawk Channel. Just off the southern passage to the city of Marathon lays a well-known but mysterious patch reef, with a secret. At first glance, this particular patch of reef resembles neighboring reefs. Upon closer examination, local divers and snorkelers found what remained of a 19-meter sailing vessel. The vessel had impaled the reef, killing hundreds of years of hard coral growth. But from this destruction came life. The environment adapted to the change, and the vessel had become the environment.
What I think is interesting about this site is that it's midway in the water column of Hawk Channel. It's not on the bottom in the sand. It hit a coral reef that goes from 22 feet up to 12 feet and landed right on top of that coral reef. And over the years after it disintegrated, the top sides and the superstructure, the ballast and the lower hull created a substratum for a subsequent growth of coral, which is spectacular.
Presumed to be a Spanish colonial shipwreck, indications of its origin, destination, and purpose have been consumed by the ecosystem. The fossilization of the ship's structure, a tribute to decades of growth. The challenge, to compile enough collaborative evidence to put the mystery to rest.
The bottom line is, to do projects like this is labor intensive and can be pretty expensive, so we wanted to bring the resources of the National Marine Sanctuary Program, the resources of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary to bear to support this project so that we could do it for a reasonable budget.
So we decided it would be a good opportunity to work with the sanctuary staff, combine our personnel and resources, and come out here and make a thorough examination of this site.
One of the initial methods of dating this wreck was to determine the age of the coral that colonized it. As corals grow, the chemistry of their skeletons preserves a detailed record of the environmental conditions. Chemicals that make it into the coral skeletons mirror conditions like salinity and temperature. The chemical composition of the core sample taken reflects the historic climate, thus adding another piece to the puzzle. Slowly, the archaeologists gather information about the shipwreck that will help them meet the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's goal of preserving the Florida Keys' rich maritime history.
The National Marine Sanctuary Program in the last couple of years has instituted a Maritime Heritage Program that encompasses all of the sanctuaries.
Helping the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary provide Americans with a window to their past are the Underwater Archaeologists.
Well, I work as the State Underwater Archaeologist for the Florida Division of Historical Resources, and we have a small but ambitious team, and we work all over the state of Florida, not only on things in the sea, but also on things in the rivers and in sinkholes and lakes. So it's basically a lot of underwater work in a state where there's a lot of things that are underwater. Why is this shipwreck a mystery wreck? How old is it? What's left of the ship itself? How did it become incorporated into the environment? What condition is it in, and what condition is the marine life that lives in it?
And these researchers have fewer resources to answer these questions. Fortunately, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary applied for and received a mini grant from NOAA's Maritime Heritage Program.
Well, this shipwreck is a good example of how sites that have been discovered were never totally investigated and left alone for years. This site was worked briefly for a 6-week period in 1972. And it was given a number, 8MO, Monroe County, 143. And it's in the master site file in Tallahassee, among thousands of other sites and historic buildings. But we didn't know very much about it at all. Local people called it the mystery wreck, and it was a mystery wreck for us too.
With funding in place, the time had come to assemble a team of researchers to begin collecting data. Over the course of a week, the team would live aboard the vessel Odyssey and spend every waking moment compiling the data into a model. Using this model, they can develop plausible theories about the ship's origin and fate.
We have a lot of work to do, and we rely a lot on volunteers, partners like the people from NOAA, the National Park Service, and also various museums around the state. We work a lot with universities and utilize students and help to train those students because we think that Florida needs more archaeologists than it has.
Spanish galleons holding vast riches are the shipwrecks that capture the public's imagination. To the untrained eye, the Marathon Mystery Wreck scarcely resembles a ship. The wreck intrigued the researchers, not for any gold or silver treasures, but for its design, rarely seen among the Spanish fleet. And they are drawn by the challenge that drives most archaeologists: solving the mystery. What ship is it, and how did it sink?
Sometimes it's really hard to come up with a positive identification, a name for a ship, but everything is possible. And so we started basically looking at a collection of artifacts in Tallahassee.
This area houses all of the collections of the Bureau of Archaeological Research, all of the things that have been recovered from terrestrial and underwater sites, starting with the early Paleolithic period all the way up to modern historic periods.
That came from 1972, and it included samples of ballast stones, pottery sherds, lead, musket shot, some lead sheathing from the hull of the ship, a couple of fasteners, a large cannonball, and we studied those artifacts and then studied what little records were made back in 1972.
It seems to be a fairly lightly framed vessel. It is a fairly small vessel. It's about 19 meters long. We suppose it to be part of a Spanish fleet, but not a galleon or anything that would have been carrying cargo.
And it looks to us to have been kind of a double-ended sailing vessel, rather than your usual picture of a large sailing galleon. It could have been a scout, a dispatch boat, sailing in the vanguard of a large fleet. And these were the ships that would have gone ahead and notified different ports that the fleet was coming, and also keep a lookout for pirates who might be laying in ambush.
After dimensions of the wreckage are collected and the pieces come together like a jigsaw puzzle, the team will construct an accurate model of the wreck. 2 angles, one overhead and one from the side, will give the team a 3-dimensional map.
Mapping that to understand what kind of ship this was and how it was built.
Another interesting thing is that in the stern the keel is cracked and twisted, and we can see where the bow was and how the frames there are cracked and collapsed. The front of the keel is broken off on impact, showing us how hard the impact was when the ship struck the reef hundreds of years ago.
Most wreck sites are seen from the surface as a large pile of ballast stone. To layman's eyes, the ballast stone look like small boulders piled on top of one another. Only after brushing sand away from the site do the remains of the wreck become visible. This patch reef is one of 3 in this area that lay parallel to the shoreline. Although all 3 patches occur in similar environmental conditions, the patch with the wreck is vastly different.
Well, the ship is unique in many different ways, but the site itself is what is most unusual, and what an amazing array of marine life. All kinds of coral and fish make their home on this site, and they have for generations and generations and generations. It's like a condominium at the bottom of the channel.
While some fish and invertebrates that lived at the wreck site at the time of collision lost their habitat, in time, Reef reclaimed the seafloor, encasing the ship's remains amidst a dazzling array of marine life.
And I suppose once the fish got in those tunnels that were created by water cooling, they helped to scour that out too. And so you can look almost through the shipwreck the skeleton of the wooden hull with a strong light, and see frame after frame after frame. It's well preserved over hundreds of years under this cap of coral and ballast stone.
Using video, photographs, measuring tape, and the time-tested tools of paper and pencil, the team fits each piece together to form their model. After determining the dimensions and the layout of the wooden structure, artifacts were examined for clues to the origins of the vessel.
We'll be taking samples of pottery, samples of ballast, and more importantly, samples of wood from the different frames. We want to know what kind of wood this is, because that might help us to determine where the ship was built.
Patience is part of the job. 2 months later, the results from the wood indicate that this vessel was most likely built in the Mediterranean and sailed in the 16 to 1700s. This fact, along with the identification of the pottery specific for that era, can narrow down the possible time and place that this ship sailed.
When it struck the reef, it was salvaged. There's no sign of any kind of cargo. There's no sign of any kind of personal possessions. No sign of any kind of tackle, navigational equipment. So being in shallow water where it is, it would have been fairly easy to recover what was worth taking, and they did.
Without any personal belongings to be identified, the origin of the crew is unknown. The salvage most likely took place decades, if not centuries ago.
Well, the site is protected both under state law because it's in state waters and protected under federal law because it's in the marine sanctuary.
Visitors to any shipwreck, should they happen to find an artifact, must leave the item for the rest of the diving community to enjoy. This is one of the reasons Florida's historical maritime sites remain so appealing.
So Florida is a very interesting and unusual place to work because there are so many rivers, so much coastline, and so many things from prehistoric sites all the way up to Civil War sites. So here is a site that's spectacular, and it's worth a visit to see. What an old shipwreck looks like after all these years, cemented in between layers of coral. A wonderful place to snorkel on a clear, calm day. A wonderful place to explore, spending an afternoon on scuba.
The story of this historic vessel remains a mystery. The mission on which the ship ventured, unknown. Now, at rest on the ocean bottom, its remains invite divers to appreciate the real treasures of the Florida Keys, the wonders of the coral reef, and the tales of our past.